The fury coursed through my veins as I watched Victoria Blackstone emerge from her pristine white luxury SUV, clutching an official-looking document like it was her ticket to supremacy. October 15th marked both the day she handed me a $250 penalty for allegedly violating parking regulations on my own property, and the moment she unknowingly gave me the ammunition to dismantle her entire homeowners association power structure. The sharp metallic sound of her newly installed security barrier echoed across the crisp fall morning as she blocked access to my crossing. This wasn't just any crossing. It was the same wooden span my late grandfather had constructed by hand during the war years of 1944, connecting our family's retreat to the outside world. Illegal vehicle placement, she announced with authority, gesturing toward my pickup truck stationed on land that had belonged to my family for 4 generations. Victoria had no idea that I possessed sole ownership of the only route connecting her upscale housing development to the main road. Every homeowner in those 43 expensive houses depended on crossing my family's property to reach their suburban paradise. Are you currently battling an autocratic HOA leader? Drop a comment about your location because the events that unfolded next will make every revenge story you've heard seem tame by comparison. Let me start from the beginning of this saga. My name is Marcus Rivera, age 36, and I work as a civil engineer specializing in infrastructure development, a detail that becomes crucial to understanding this story. 2 years prior, my grandfather left me his 1940s fishing lodge situated on Crystal Lake. This property wasn't ordinary. It occupied 4 acres of untouched lakefront, accessible exclusively via a narrow wooden bridge spanning Miller's Creek. My work in sustainable infrastructure takes me around the globe for months at a time, so visits to the lodge were infrequent. Nevertheless, that rustic cabin held immense sentimental value. Grandpa had taught me to cast lines from that old pier, helped me recognize every wildlife sound carried across the water, and shared countless evenings recounting tales of constructing that bridge with nothing but determination and basic tools. The surrounding landscape had transformed dramatically over the previous 5 years. Dense woodland and agricultural fields had given way to a manufactured community of nearly identical homes, each appearing mass-produced from the same architectural template. Pleasant enough structures, but hardly the natural sanctuary my grandfather had cherished. Enter Victoria Blackstone, 54 years old, who had relocated from an urban environment 3 years earlier with aspirations of becoming the neighborhood's self-declared enforcement officer. She secured her position as HOA chairwoman by pledging to enhance property values through rigid compliance standards, which apparently involved measuring lawn heights with precision instruments and monitoring visitor duration with stopwatch accuracy. Victoria drove an immaculate white SUV that gleamed constantly, maintained perfectly polished fingernails, and carried an expensive leather folder as if negotiating corporate mergers instead of harassing residents about decorative choices. She had a particular way of observing my cabin, referring to it as that primitive structure when she believed I was out of earshot. The social prejudice was subtle yet unmistakable. When I returned from a 7-month assignment in Norway, I discovered a sophisticated new barrier system blocking the approach to my bridge. This wasn't amateur work. Heavy-duty construction with reinforced concrete foundations and metallic components that resonated through the forest with each opening and closing. Victoria waited nearby, portfolio ready, surrounded by that costly fragrance that somehow overpowered the natural pine scent filling the air. She presented an authoritative document claiming the bridge access road had been reclassified as community property based on recent surveying work. According to her documentation, roadway maintenance fell under HOA jurisdiction, granting them access control authority. The violation notice was a masterpiece of bureaucratic intimidation, $250 for unauthorized vehicle storage due to my truck's presence at the cabin, plus $75 for each day of non-compliance. The financial penalties were accumulating rapidly. "I trust you comprehend the situation," Victoria stated with artificial politeness. "We cannot permit unauthorized vehicles cluttering our community thoroughfares. Property values are our primary concern." I ran my fingers across the rough concrete texture of those new barrier posts, while listening to the familiar sound of Miller's Creek flowing beneath the bridge. The entire scenario felt surreal. This was the same crossing I'd traversed countless times during childhood, the same waterway where Grandpa had taught me stone-skipping techniques. Most newer residents appeared to endorse Victoria's authoritarian management style. But the longtime locals who remembered the area before development showed quiet sympathy. Dorothy Williams, a retired educator living nearest to the bridge, discreetly passed me a message as I walked back to my vehicle. Examined the public records. Something doesn't add up. As I drove away, gravel crackling beneath my tires, I was already formulating my response strategy. Victoria had committed one fatal error. She assumed I was just another compliant resident who would pay up and remain silent. She had no understanding that she'd just challenged someone who constructs bridges professionally and understood exactly what documentation governs ownership of such structures. Victoria wasted no time escalating the conflict. Within 7 days of our barrier encounter, I received a legal cease and desist notice from an attorney with impressive letterhead. The formal language was crafted to intimidate, alleging that my continued trespassing endangered neighborhood children. Ironic, considering no kids actually lived near the bridge area. The letter demanded payment of accumulated penalties, which had mysteriously inflated to $525, or face immediate litigation for property damage and public safety violations. Victoria was also active at the local cafe, spreading rumors about my being unreasonable and making threats. Neither allegation had any basis in reality, but small-town gossip has its own momentum. I could have responded with anger, could have confronted Victoria directly at her immaculate house with its manicured landscaping. Instead, I applied the methodical approach engineers employ. I collected evidence. The municipal courthouse carried that distinctive scent of aged documents and floor polish, with flickering fluorescent lighting buzzing like agitated insects overhead. I invested 4 hours examining property records, handling delicate parchment papers worn smooth from decades of use. My discovery was absolutely beautiful from a legal standpoint. Grandpa's original 1944 property deed encompassed not only the cabin and 4-acre parcel, but specifically included complete ownership of the bridge structure, documented in meticulous detail including timber specifications and foundation depth measurements. The HOA's surveyor had researched everything except the most critical component. They had conveniently overlooked this essential information in their assessment. But the truly interesting part was an easement provision requiring me to permit reasonable access for anyone needing to cross the bridge. Seemed equitable enough. Grandpa was always fair-minded. However, the specifics mattered tremendously. The provision explicitly defined reasonable as maximum 15 vehicles daily. 15 total. The current Lakeside Manor development contained 51 homes, most housing multiple vehicles. Simple arithmetic revealed the problem. Legal insight. Easement restrictions can be limited by original deed specifications, and courts consistently uphold the precise language written by the initial property owner. Always examine the fine print. It usually contains important details. When I realized I essentially controlled access to most of the subdivision, I confess I smiled with satisfaction. But Victoria wasn't finished with her campaign. She escalated by installing surveillance equipment aimed directly at my bridge, claiming community safety monitoring purposes. Then she began maintaining detailed violation logs, documenting every instance I crossed to my own property like she was building a criminal case. The woman even pressured other residents to sign a petition demanding my cooperation with community regulations. Most people signed simply to stop her persistent door-to-door visits. Victoria's teenage son was present during one of these petition drives, and I swear that kid's eye-rolling was so dramatic I worried he might injure himself. The community was beginning to take notice. Dorothy Williams whispered to me at the postal facility, with Miller's Creek babbling nearby to mask our conversation, that Victoria had been investigating my financial situation. Apparently, she wanted to determine if I could afford a prolonged legal battle. 4 established residents approached me privately over the following days. Robert Chen, a military veteran residing on the lake, told me Victoria had hassled him about his flag display being oversized for community standards. Linda Martinez, who worked for the regional newspaper, mentioned Victoria had attempted to have her terminated for writing an article about property rights. An elderly pair, the Kowalskis, shared how Victoria had forced them to remove bird feeding stations because they attracted undesirable wildlife. I was starting to understand this wasn't genuinely about my bridge access. This was about a pattern of intimidation that had persisted for months, and I'd simply become the latest target. Victoria had transformed our peaceful neighborhood into her personal domain, ruling through fear and harassment. The thing is, I'd encountered petty dictators before. Construction sites are filled with people who believe minimal authority makes them Napoleon. But Victoria had made a critical miscalculation. She'd targeted someone who actually knew how to fight back, and more importantly, someone with the patience to do it correctly. As I sat on my cabin deck that evening listening to the loons calling across the water, I realized this was bigger than just my access rights. If I allowed Victoria to steamroll me, she'd continue doing it to others. Someone had to take a stand. I just happened to be the person with the bridge. Victoria's next strategy was pure economic warfare. She filed a county complaint claiming my bridge was structurally dangerous and demanded an expensive engineering assessment costing $3,800. She rallied the HOA board to approve an emergency levy for community safety and began circulating rumors around town that my overseas work was somehow suspicious. Apparently, building sustainable infrastructure projects in Norway made me some kind of international operative in Victoria's paranoid imagination. But challenging a bridge engineer over bridge safety is like challenging a master chef to a cooking contest in their own kitchen. I am a bridge engineer. I assess bridges professionally. This particular bridge, I could evaluate it blindfolded. I spent a Saturday morning giving my grandfather's bridge the complete professional treatment. Every connection, every support member, every stress point was photographed and documented. The sound of my work boots on those solid planks echoed across the water as I worked, and the familiar scent of wood preservative brought back memories of assisting Grandpa with upkeep when I was 13. My findings were beautiful from an engineering perspective. Grandpa had constructed this bridge like he expected it to survive the apocalypse. The structure was rated for 25 tons. It could support a fire engine if required. Meanwhile, I couldn't help noticing that Victoria's own deck displayed several obvious code violations visible from the bridge approach. Engineering insight. A bridge rated for 25 tons can easily handle normal residential traffic, and you should always seek independent verification of any required inspections, particularly from someone with actual field expertise. Victoria's desperation was becoming apparent. She attempted to convince the town council to declare my bridge a public hazard, presenting a petition she claimed had unanimous neighborhood endorsement. Half the signatures were fabricated, and the other half belonged to people who thought they were signing up for a community barbecue. When that failed, she requested a restraining order claiming I'd threatened her. Problem was, she lacked witnesses because it never occurred. The judge examined her evidence and essentially dismissed her from court with prejudice. But I wasn't simply waiting for Victoria's next attack. I was conducting my own investigation. I contacted 4 residents who had supposedly endorsed her bridge petition. None had actually seen what they were signing. Victoria had appeared at their doors with a clipboard and some story about neighborhood improvements. Here's where it becomes interesting. I live in a single-party consent state, meaning I can legally record phone conversations without informing the other party. So when Victoria's attorney called to negotiate, I activated my recording device. 25 minutes into the conversation, that lawyer accidentally admitted they knew I owned the bridge, but were hoping I wouldn't contest it because most people don't understand property law. He actually said, and I quote, "Frankly, we're counting on this guy not knowing his rights." Wrong assumption, counselor. My cat Smokey had become an unofficial character judge during this drama. That gray tabby would sit in the cabin window and hiss whenever Victoria's SUV passed by. Even my cat recognized something was wrong with this woman. The community was slowly awakening to what was really happening. Dorothy Williams revealed she was actually a retired legal assistant and offered to help with research. Robert Chen shared his own expertise with bridge construction from his military engineering background. Linda Martinez, the local reporter, started asking pointed questions about HOA finances. We held our strategy meetings at Dorothy's kitchen table, and let me tell you, the woman made coffee strong enough to wake the dead. During one of these sessions, Linda brought up something interesting. The HOA's financial records were public, and Victoria had been spending money like she was managing a small corporation instead of a neighborhood association. The evening loons were calling across the lake when Dorothy dropped the real bombshell. She'd discovered the HOA's budget reports, and they were spending almost double their income. Victoria had approved a $45,000 landscaping project that essentially amounted to some decorative rocks and a few bushes. That's when I realized what this was actually about. The HOA was desperate for new revenue, and they thought controlling my bridge would allow them to charge me monthly access fees. Victoria wasn't just power hungry. She was attempting to solve a financial crisis by picking my pocket. The scent of fresh pine drifted through Dorothy's open kitchen window as we reviewed documents, and I felt that familiar engineer satisfaction when all the pieces of a complex problem finally start falling into place. Victoria had no idea what kind of storm she'd just created. Victoria's next move was straight sabotage. She hired a contractor to install what she called aesthetic improvements along the bridge approach. Concrete obstacles positioned to appear like landscaping, but actually designed to prevent my truck from reaching the bridge. The grinding sound of the concrete saw at 6:30 a.m. woke up half the neighborhood, and the dust cloud hanging in the air resembled a small cyclone touching down. When I arrived to find my access completely blocked, Victoria was there with her clipboard, claiming it was a beautification project approved by the design committee. Interesting fact about that committee: it consisted entirely of Victoria and 2 residents who followed her orders to avoid getting on her bad side. But Victoria had finally made a mistake I could use in court. I filed an emergency injunction to have those obstacles removed, armed with my original bridge deed and a proper survey clearly showing the approach road as part of my property. The judge was not pleased. When Victoria attempted to argue with His Honor about community standards and property values, he interrupted her mid-sentence and ordered the barriers removed within 24 hours. Then he fined her $3,000 for contempt when she continued talking. Standing outside the courthouse, I took the opportunity to educate the small crowd that had gathered. Legal insight: you cannot block someone's lawful access to their property. That's called landlocking, and it's illegal in all 50 states. Courts take property access rights very seriously, so document everything if someone tries to restrict your access. Victoria's retaliation was swift and predictable. She launched a harassment campaign that would have impressed a middle school bully. Anonymous tips to county inspectors about safety violations at my cabin, noise complaints about my truck, which visited exactly twice monthly, pressure on HOA residents to ostracize me and anyone who supported me. The woman even tried to have my professional engineering license investigated, claiming I was mentally unstable and posed a threat to public safety. The state licensing board examined my record and essentially told her to stop wasting their time. But something interesting was happening in the community. Robert Chen organized what he called the Bridge Defense Alliance, a group of residents fed up with Victoria's reign of terror. Dorothy Williams was using her legal assistant skills to dig deeper into Victoria's background, and her findings were fascinating. Victoria had pulled similar stunts in her previous community before relocating to Cedar Falls. She'd been involved in neighbor disputes, filed frivolous lawsuits, and generally made life miserable for anyone who crossed her. The woman had a pattern. Linda Martinez was conducting her own investigation into the HOA's finances, and the numbers weren't adding up. There were irregular payments, mysterious consulting fees, and expenditures that didn't match any visible improvements to the community. Then my homeowner's insurance agent mentioned something interesting during a routine call. If anything happened to my bridge, if it was damaged or destroyed, the HOA residents would become landlocked too. Their property values would plummet without bridge access, and most insurance companies would refuse to cover properties that couldn't be reached by emergency vehicles. When I shared this revelation with the Bridge Defense Alliance, you could practically hear the light bulbs clicking on. Victoria wasn't just harassing me. She was potentially destroying everyone's property values with her reckless behavior. Victoria must have sensed the tide turning because she called an emergency HOA meeting to discuss what she termed the Marcus problem. Her PowerPoint presentation, complete with Comic Sans font, which made even her supporters cringe, proposed a special assessment to buy out my bridge rights for the insulting sum of $8,000. Legal insight. HOA board members have fiduciary duties, meaning they're legally required to act in the community's best interest, not their own. Embezzlement from HOA funds is a felony in most states, and residents have the right to see all financial records. Demand transparency. The technical preparation was crucial, but the real work was building community support. I visited every affected resident personally, explaining the situation without attacking Victoria's character. I let the facts speak for themselves. The response was overwhelming. People were angry about being manipulated, but they were angrier about being robbed. We built a coalition of 36 out of 51 homeowners. These weren't just signatures on a petition. These were people ready to stand up and be counted when things got tough. Robert's wife started bringing homemade cookies to our planning sessions, and she dubbed us the Bridge Club, which actually stuck. Smokey, my gray tabby, became our unofficial mascot, attending every meeting and providing moral support by purring loudly whenever we made progress. Dorothy's color-coded filing system was so thorough, it would have impressed the FBI. Every document was cross-referenced, every timeline verified, every piece of evidence organized for maximum impact. The woman had missed her calling as a federal investigator, but Victoria wasn't sitting idle. She tried to spy on our activities, hiring a private investigator to find dirt on me. She spread rumors that our planning group was made up of conspiracy theorists trying to destroy the community. She even attempted to schedule a competing HOA meeting on the same night as the town hall we'd requested. Meanwhile, I was reaching out to my professional network. Engineering colleagues provided character references. Previous clients sent testimonials about my integrity. My professional association confirmed my stellar reputation. Even contacts from my international sustainable infrastructure work vouched for the legitimacy of my overseas projects. The trap we were setting was elegant in its simplicity. We were going to let Victoria hang herself at a public meeting with county officials and media present. I prepared questions that would force her to lie publicly, and Linda Martinez had already alerted state fraud investigators about the embezzlement. The sound of papers rustling filled Dorothy's kitchen as we organized our evidence for maximum impact. We assigned speaking roles to different team members, prepared backup plans for Victoria's likely responses, and arranged media coverage to ensure accountability. The texture of those smooth bridge cables under my hands during evening inspections reminded me why I became an engineer in the first place: to build things that last, to solve problems that matter, to make communities stronger and safer. Victoria had spent months trying to tear down what my grandfather had built. Now it was time to show her what happens when you pick a fight with someone who builds bridges instead of burning them. As autumn leaves crunched under our feet during final preparations, I realized this had become about much more than property rights. This was about standing up to bullies, protecting communities from predators, proving that regular people could fight back against corruption when they worked together. The loons were calling across Crystal Lake as we finalized our plans, their voices echoing the same message that had been flowing under my bridge all along. Some things are worth fighting for, and patience combined with truth is an unstoppable force. Victoria was about to discover that the hard way. Victoria's desperation reached new heights when she attempted to physically damage my bridge at 2:30 in the morning with a crowbar. The metallic scraping sounds and her labored breathing were captured in crystal clear audio by the security camera I'd installed after her earlier sabotage attempts. Watching that footage the next morning was surreal. There was the HOA chairwoman, this woman who lectured everyone about community standards, attacking private property like some kind of deranged vandal. The damage was minimal. Grandpa's bridge was built too well for a crowbar to do much harm. But the intent was clear as day. I filed a police report but didn't press charges immediately. Instead, I used the footage strategically, quietly sharing it with the remaining HOA board members who still had any sense left. The effect was immediate. 2 more board members resigned rather than be associated with Victoria's increasingly unhinged behavior. But Victoria wasn't done embarrassing herself. She launched a full-scale smear campaign using anonymous social media accounts to attack my reputation. Fake reviews of my engineering work started appearing online. Posts claiming I was dangerous and mentally unstable popped up on neighborhood Facebook groups. The cyberbullying was actually working against her. Digital insight. Anonymous online. Attacks can be traced and prosecuted, and defamation is defamation whether it's spoken or posted online. Screenshot everything. Digital evidence disappears quickly, but screenshots are forever. The community was getting disgusted with Victoria's behavior. Her own neighbors started reporting suspicious late-night activity around her house. The support that had once propped up her reign of terror was evaporating faster than morning dew. Meanwhile, Dorothy Williams' banking contacts had uncovered something even more damaging. Victoria had attempted to take an emergency loan against the HOA reserves without proper board approval. When the bank refused, she'd forged board members' signatures on the loan documents. That's when I knew we had her completely. Embezzlement was bad enough, but forgery, that was federal crime territory. Victoria must have sensed the walls closing in because she made one last desperate play. She offered me a bribe, called me up out of the blue with her voice shaking, offering $18,000 to drop everything and move on. I recorded that conversation legally, and it was a goldmine. Victoria actually admitted she may have made mistakes with HOA funds. She accidentally confessed to other financial irregularities I hadn't even discovered yet. The woman was falling apart in real time. "Look, Marcus," she said, her voice cracking. "Maybe I got a little overzealous about community standards. Maybe some paperwork got mixed up, but we can work this out privately, can't we?" The community tension was reaching a breaking point. Some residents feared their property values would suffer from the scandal. Others were furious that they'd been paying HOA fees to fund Victoria's crimes. The once peaceful neighborhood felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for the other shoe to drop. The uncomfortable silence at community gatherings was deafening. People chose sides in grocery store aisles. Former friends stopped speaking to each other. Victoria had managed to divide a community that had lived in harmony for years, but not everyone was fooled by her act. 4 more residents came forward, with their own Victoria horror stories: harassment, financial irregularities, and abuse of power that went back to her first year as HOA chairwoman. The pattern was clear to anyone willing to see it. Victoria's final threat was the most revealing of all. She called me one evening, completely unhinged, threatening to destroy my reputation if I didn't back down. She claimed she had connections, who would ruin my career, and implied she'd fabricate safety violations on my bridge if I kept pushing. The woman was clearly detached from reality. She was facing criminal charges, had lost the support of her community, and her husband had moved, out with the kids. Yet she still thought she could intimidate her way out of the mess she'd created. I documented every escalation methodically, building a timeline that showed Victoria's increasingly erratic behavior. My restraint and professionalism throughout. The whole ordeal stood in stark contrast to her desperate thrashing. As I sat on my bridge that evening, listening to the water flow below and watching the stars reflect on Crystal Lake's surface, I realized Victoria had become her own worst enemy. Every move she made to escape accountability just dug her hole deeper. The irony wasn't lost on me. She'd started this whole thing to steal money and maintain power through fear. Now she was facing criminal prosecution and had destroyed her own reputation so thoroughly that she'd never hold authority over anyone again. Sometimes the best revenge is just giving your enemies enough rope to hang themselves. Victoria's final desperate act was calling county emergency services at 1:45 a.m., claiming my bridge was actively collapsing and posed an immediate threat to public safety. The sirens wailing through the quiet night woke up half the neighborhood, with fire trucks, ambulances, and emergency vehicles racing toward the bridge, with diesel engines rumbling and radio chatter filling the air. I got the call from the fire chief at 2:23 a.m. "Marcus, we've got reports of structural failure at your bridge. We need you down here to assess the situation." When I arrived, Victoria was standing there in her bathrobe, pointing dramatically at the bridge and claiming she'd heard cracking sounds that indicated imminent collapse. The fire chief, a no-nonsense guy named Captain Rodriguez, took one look at the perfectly solid bridge and then looked at me. "You're the engineer who builds infrastructure overseas, right?" he asked. When I nodded, he said, "Mind taking a look and telling us what you think?" My professional examination took about 12 minutes. Every joint was solid, every support beam was exactly where it should be, and the structure was as sound as the day Grandpa finished building it. Captain Rodriguez watched me work, and when I gave him my assessment, he announced publicly that the bridge was safer than most county roads. Victoria's credibility died right there in front of a dozen witnesses. The fire chief didn't mince words. "Ma'am, filing false emergency reports is a crime. You've wasted taxpayer resources and endangered real emergencies by tying up our crews." But the real bombshell came the next morning when the state investigators finished their forensic audit of the HOA finances. The number was staggering. $36,000 in unexplained expenses, all traced back to Victoria's personal accounts through fake invoices for consulting services that never existed. Financial insight. Every digital transaction leaves permanent records, and forensic accountants are like bloodhounds when it comes to following money trails. Embezzlement often starts small but escalates quickly when nobody's watching. Victoria's psychological breakdown was painful to witness. She started accusing random neighbors of being part of conspiracies against her. She left paranoid notes on people's doors, claiming Marcus was part of some deep state plot to destroy suburban communities. Her husband had already moved out with the kids, and even her most loyal supporters were quietly backing away. But something beautiful was happening in the community. Residents organized a bridge appreciation day, bringing picnics to eat near the bridge and celebrating the structure that connected their neighborhood. Kids drew chalk art on the bridge approaches, turning Victoria's symbol of division into something that brought people together. The media attention was incredible. Linda Martinez's article got picked up by regional news stations, and the story went viral on social media with the hashtag #BridgeJustice. National HOA reform advocates started citing our case as a perfect example of what happens when petty tyrants get unchecked power. Victoria became a cautionary tale in property rights circles, the poster child for everything wrong with HOA culture. Her face was plastered across news websites as the HOA president who tried to steal a bridge. The legal consequences were mounting fast. The state attorney general filed criminal charges for embezzlement and fraud. The HOA filed a civil lawsuit demanding restitution. Her real estate license was under review for professional misconduct. The IRS started asking uncomfortable questions about unreported income. As I sat on my bridge at sunset, processing everything that had happened, I realized this fight had never really been about me personally. I'd become a symbol of something bigger, the idea that ordinary people could stand up to petty tyranny and win. The evening birds were calling across the lake, and the peaceful silence felt like a benediction after months of conflict. Victoria had tried to turn my inheritance into her personal cash cow, but instead she'd awakened a community that refused to be bullied. Her final desperate act was attempting to flee town with the remaining HOA funds she could access, about $9,500 in cash. Airport security stopped her at the gate, and the local news cameras captured her perp walk in all its pathetic glory. Standing there in handcuffs, her perfectly manicured image finally cracked. Victoria looked like what she'd always been underneath the expensive clothes and fake authority. Just another small-time crook who'd gotten too greedy for her own good. The woman who'd spent months trying to destroy my reputation was now a national laughingstock, her own actions having accomplished what no enemy could have managed. She'd built her own prison out of lies, theft, and abuse of power. As the police car drove away with Victoria in the back seat, I couldn't help but think about Grandpa's bridge, still standing strong, still connecting communities, still serving its purpose long after the person who tried to steal it had been forgotten. Some things are built to last. Others are just built to fall. The town hall was packed beyond capacity. 180 people crammed into a space designed for maybe half that, with news cameras from 4 different stations and reporters taking notes in the back. The mayor had called, This emergency meeting after Victoria's arrest made regional headlines, and everyone wanted to see how this community soap opera would end. I walked to the podium with my presentation materials, feeling remarkably calm for someone about to expose months of corruption in front of half the county. The visual aids were simple but devastating: a timeline of harassment, copies of the original bridge deed, and financial records showing exactly where the HOA's money had gone. "Ladies and gentlemen," I began, "7 months ago, I thought I was dealing with an overzealous HOA chairwoman. What I discovered was systematic theft from your community funds, harassment of residents, and abuse of power that turned our neighborhood into a dictatorship." The room was dead silent as I walked through the evidence. Every harassment incident documented with photos and timestamps. Every financial irregularity traced through bank records. Every lie Victoria had told exposed with official documents. That couldn't be disputed. Victoria sat in the front row, flanked by her court-appointed attorney and a county sheriff's deputy. She was technically out on bail, but her lawyer had advised her not to speak. That advice lasted about 6 minutes. When I played the recording of Victoria's bribery attempt, where her own voice admitted to mistakes with HOA funds, Victoria jumped to her feet and started shouting accusations. "This is all a conspiracy. Marcus orchestrated my financial problems. He's been planning this from the beginning." Her lawyer tried to pull her back down, but Victoria was beyond reason. She pointed wildly around the room, claiming everyone was out to get her, that I had somehow forced her to embezzle money and harass neighbors. The woman was having a complete psychological breakdown in front of 180 witnesses and 4 news cameras. "Mrs. Blackstone," the mayor interrupted, "you're out." "Of order." "Please sit down." "Out of order?" Victoria screamed. "I'll show you what's out of order. This man has destroyed everything I worked to build in this community." That's when I delivered the line I'd been saving for this moment. "Victoria, the only thing you built in this community was a criminal enterprise funded by your neighbor's HOA fees. The only thing I destroyed was your ability to keep stealing from the people who trusted you." The crowd erupted in applause. Even some of Victoria's former supporters were clapping. Camera flashes illuminated the room as photographers captured the moment when a small-town tyrant finally got called out in public. Dorothy Williams took the microphone next, explaining how her legal research had exposed the fraudulent property claims. Robert Chen described the harassment campaign against veterans in the community. 4 other residents shared their own stories of Victoria's bullying tactics. The pattern was undeniable. This wasn't about one dispute over bridge access. This was about a systematic pattern of abuse that had been going on for years. County Sheriff Martinez explained the criminal charges: embezzlement in the 1st degree, fraud, forgery, and filing false police reports. The state investigator outlined the ongoing case, mentioning that federal authorities were reviewing potential tax violations. The FBI representative confirmed they were looking into mail fraud charges related to the fake HOA documents. Judge Patterson, who was attending as a community member, announced the emergency restraining order that prohibited Victoria from HOA property or meetings. She was also required to surrender all HOA documents and any remaining funds in her possession. The HOA media attention was intense. Reporters asked me about property rights advocacy. National HOA reform organizations contacted me about testifying before state legislatures. The story was trending on social media, with thousands of comments from people sharing their own HOA horror stories. Victoria's final humiliation came when Sheriff Martinez led her away in handcuffs while news cameras rolled. The woman who had terrorized an entire neighborhood was now a cautionary tale broadcast across the region. Children who had once been afraid of her nasty glares waved goodbye as the police car pulled away. The community response was cathartic. People who hadn't spoken to each other in months were hugging and apologizing for letting the situation go on so long. Neighbors who had been afraid to speak up were finally sharing their stories. The smell of coffee and nervous energy filled the packed room as residents began planning their community's recovery. Camera flashes continued popping as photographers documented not just Victoria's downfall, but the moment when a neighborhood decided to heal and move forward together. As the meeting ended and people filed out into the cool evening air, I felt a profound sense of closure. Grandpa's bridge had become more than just access to a cabin. It had become a symbol of standing up to bullies and protecting communities from predators. Justice had been served, but more importantly, a community had learned it could fight back. The transformation of our community was remarkable. Within 30 days, we'd elected a new HOA board, with Dorothy Williams as chairwoman, chosen unanimously by residents who'd learned the hard way what happens when you give unchecked power to the wrong person. They asked me to serve on the board, but I politely declined. I'd had enough of HOA politics to last a lifetime. Victoria's legal troubles snowballed exactly as you'd expect. She pleaded guilty to embezzlement and fraud, receiving 3 years in prison and 6 years probation. The judge ordered her to pay $52,000 in restitution to the HOA, money that went toward fixing the financial mess she'd created. Her real estate license was permanently revoked, and her husband filed for divorce before she even got out on bail. But the real healing happened in the community itself. I organized the first annual Bridge Festival that November, exactly 1 year after Victoria had tried to block my access. Families brought picnics, kids played games on the bridge approaches, and we raised $9,200 for local veterans programs that Robert Chen recommended. The most meaningful moment came when Victoria's teenage son showed up with a handwritten apology letter. That kid had watched his mother's behavior with horror and wanted to make things right. He became the first recipient of the engineering scholarship fund I established with donations from grateful community members. My personal life took an unexpected turn too. Instead of returning to overseas work, I decided to open an engineering consulting firm right here in Cedar Falls. Turns out there's a huge need for someone who specializes in helping small communities with infrastructure issues, and I'd found my calling in service rather than just profit. The property rights education website I created has helped dozens of other communities facing similar HOA tyranny. I've testified before 4 state legislatures about HOA reform, and the Cedar Falls case is now cited in legal textbooks as an example of how communities can fight back against corruption. The conservation initiative around the bridge became something Grandpa would have loved. We partnered with environmental groups to turn the area into a protected wildlife habitat, complete with educational programs about the local ecosystem. The bridge that Victoria tried to steal became a symbol of community stewardship and environmental protection. Property values in Lakeside Manor actually increased after the scandal, which surprised everyone except real estate professionals. Turns out buyers prefer communities that have proven they can handle corruption, rather than places where it might still be lurking in the shadows. Linda Martinez won a regional journalism award for her investigative reporting on HOA financial abuse. Dorothy Williams's systematic documentation methods are now taught in paralegal schools across the state. Robert Chen started a consulting service helping other communities organize against HOA abuse. The Bridge Defense Alliance evolved into a permanent community advocacy group that helps residents navigate disputes and ensures transparent governance. They meet monthly at Dorothy's house, and yes, Smokey still attends every meeting as the official mascot. Victoria's former house became a community garden after the bank foreclosed. There's something poetic about vegetables growing where such toxicity once lived. Kids who were once afraid of her angry face now play among tomato plants and sunflowers. 8 months ago, a family moved to Cedar Falls specifically because they'd heard about our community's fight against corruption. They said they wanted to live somewhere that had proven it wouldn't tolerate bullies. That's when I knew we'd really won. The final statistics tell the story. HOA financial health restored within 7 months, 0 harassment complaints filed since Victoria's removal, and 15 other communities have contacted me for help with similar situations. The county declared Grandpa's Bridge historically significant, ensuring it'll be protected for future generations. But perhaps the most important outcome was what happened to our community's character. We learned that ordinary people, when they work together with patience and determination, can defeat even the most entrenched corruption. We discovered that bullies only have power when good people choose to remain silent. The legal precedent we set has been cited in court cases across 3 states. The Cedar Falls Standard, our comprehensive documentation and community organizing approach, is now taught in law schools as a model for grassroots legal action against HOA abuse. Victoria, served 18 months of her 3-year sentence before being released on parole. She moved to another state where public records show she's working as a retail clerk under strict probation conditions that prohibit her from holding any fiduciary positions. The woman who once ruled a community through fear now stocks shelves for minimum wage. Her former husband remarried and still lives in the community with their children, who have thrived without their mother's toxic influence. The teenage son I mentioned earlier graduated with honors and is now studying engineering at the state university on the scholarship fund we established. The bridge itself underwent a professional restoration last year, funded by community donations and a state historic preservation grant. We used traditional materials and methods that Grandpa would have approved of, strengthening the structure while maintaining its original character. Looking back, I realize this story isn't really about property rights or HOA disputes. It's about what happens when ordinary people decide they've had enough of being pushed around by petty tyrants. It's about the power of patience, documentation, and community solidarity in the face of corruption and abuse. The evening loons, still, call across Crystal Lake, their voices carrying the same message that Miller's Creek has been whispering under my bridge all along. Some things are worth fighting for, and justice may be slow, but it's inevitable when good people refuse to give up. Today, as I write this from my cabin porch, I can hear children's laughter echoing across the bridge during our second annual festival. The smell of barbecue smoke mixes with fresh autumn air, and Old Glory flies proudly from the bridge tower. Grandpa's structure stands solid and enduring, just like the justice it came to represent. The lesson Victoria learned in prison, that real authority comes from service, not intimidation, is one that every community leader should remember. But more importantly, our victory proved that regular people don't have to accept corruption and abuse. They just need the courage to stand up, the wisdom to document everything, and the patience to let bullies defeat themselves. Now I want to hear from you. Share your own HOA nightmare stories in the comments below. You'd be amazed how many of these situations follow the same pattern of financial irregularities hidden behind harassment campaigns. And if this story inspired you to stand up to bullies in your own community, remember, you're not alone. You have more power than you think, and sometimes all it takes is one person willing to fight back to give everyone else permission to stop being afraid. The bridge my grandfather built with his own hands has now connected our community in ways he never could have imagined. It stands as proof that some things, justice, community, and the courage to do what's right, are built to last forever.